Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about the HOA that sold my property at auction. I'd always assumed the biggest obstacle to enjoying my fishing lodge would be run-ins with the local wildlife or the occasional harsh weather. Turns out, I was wrong. Nothing could have prepared me for the day I found out my own homeowners association tried to auction off my property as if it were theirs to sell. If this sounds outrageous, believe me, living through it was even more surreal. It all started when I took what I thought was a simple business trip away from my place for a little over a month. By the time I returned, I'd apparently missed not just one, but multiple notifications from the HOA that they were putting my land up for sale, claiming they had full rights to do so. As if that wasn't crazy enough, they also included my favorite fishing lodge in that sale, which has been in my family for over 3 generations. That lodge isn't just some structure I threw together with spare wood. My grandfather and father built and rebuilt it by hand. Countless memories were formed there, from learning to tie fishing lines at age 5 to celebrating major milestones like birthdays and graduations. The idea that anyone could just auction it off behind my back made me equal parts furious and bewildered. Well, that stunt cost them dearly. I sued. And not only did the court side with me, but the HOA was fined $117,000, and 2 of their leading representatives actually ended up in jail. But let me back up a bit, because the story is a lot more layered than a straightforward lawsuit. There were shady activities on the part of the HOA, plus some neighborly drama, some property boundary disputes, and more than a few missteps on their part that led to the ultimate downfall of the worst-run HOA board I've ever seen. I should probably set the stage by explaining how I came to own this property in the first place. Growing up, I was fortunate to have a father who believed in the joy and value of nature. He'd bring me out on weekends to fish at a lake that sat near a wide stretch of forest. We'd always stay in a modest lodge that had been initially built by my grandfather. Over time, we added small improvements, updated windows, replaced rickety stairs, insulated the walls for winter fishing. When my father passed, ownership transferred to me, and I swore I'd keep the lodge in good condition, both for personal enjoyment and as a tribute to the time we spent together there. The property had changed hands a few times within our extended family lines over the decades, but it was always well-maintained and always unequivocally ours, with boundary lines properly recorded. There was a small neighborhood just a short drive away, and although my lodge wasn't exactly inside the neighborhood's main area, part of the property was technically included under a newly formed homeowners association. Decades after Grandpa built that lodge, people started developing the land further inland. They built brand new houses, carved out roads, and formed an HOA to govern the roads, security gates, and communal spaces like a small park near the forest's entrance. At first, I had zero interest in all that HOA talk. I didn't care about fancy amenities or people telling me what color I could paint my door. My father didn't seem to care much either. But after he passed and I fully inherited the property, I quickly discovered I was being asked to pay some nominal fees for road maintenance and community improvements. Since it wasn't an enormous sum, I decided to go along with it for the sake of neighborly peace. I had the place in my name, the taxes were paid in full every year, and I made sure I had all the legal documents that confirmed my ownership. If the HOA wanted a few dollars a year to keep the roads in shape, I figured I could handle that. Over time, the HOA began to adopt more ambitious projects, a new tennis court near the main neighborhood, a playground expansion, and so on. Meanwhile, I was busy with my job, traveling a lot, so I never attended their monthly meetings. I assumed I'd keep quietly paying my share of fees and remain generally out of sight, out of mind. My fishing lodge was a bit separate from the main cluster of homes, and I cherished that solitude. Now, in hindsight, it seems like a few power-hungry individuals on the HOA board might have eyed my father's land for quite some time, especially the area close to the lake. They likely realized what a prime spot it was. Picturesque views, a small but reliable fishing dock, and easy access to the main road. Without my father around, and with me traveling for long stretches, they probably thought I wouldn't notice if they made a move. Fast forward to the fiasco that triggered everything. I got a new job assignment that took me out of state for about 6 weeks. I left the lodge secure, locked the doors, shut the windows, made sure no leaks or power issues would crop up. I had a friend named Caden who agreed to stop by once a week, just to make sure everything remained in good condition. Around the 3rd week of my being gone, The HOA held a meeting. Unbeknownst to me, they apparently claimed that my property was effectively abandoned. They cited outdated records that alleged my father had once been behind on HOA dues. He wasn't, and that these dues had supposedly ballooned over time. Somehow they decided that my non-attendance at the last few HOA gatherings proved I had no interest in the property. Then they went on to say that because I'd failed to respond to repeated attempts at communication, they had the right to put the property up for sale to recoup unpaid fees plus legal costs. Keep in mind, I had never received an email, phone call, or official letter from the HOA about any issues with dues. My father and I had always been ahead of schedule with payments, especially since the annual fees were never that high. The only possibility that might have triggered confusion is that my father's name was still on some older ledger from years back, and they never updated it properly to reflect that he had passed and the property had been retitled to me. But even that doesn't explain how they jumped from a possible record-keeping error to deciding they had the right to sell a fully deeded property that's listed in the county records as belonging to me. It didn't help that the HOA's leadership had a new president named Jareth, a man known for pushing boundaries and ignoring due process. According to some of my neighbors, the few who were friendly and honest enough to fill me in later, Jareth began strongly implying that my land could be repurposed for a large community boathouse or a communal fishing pier. Once he floated that idea, apparently enough HOA members saw dollar signs, thinking they could collect usage fees or membership boosts. Suddenly, my abandoned lodge became prime real estate for them to exploit. But how did it escalate to an actual auction? The next part is where it gets downright bizarre. The HOA scheduled an internal sale event where they offered up various delinquent properties. They lumped my lot in there and set a minimum bid. The official story was that they tried to notify me by sending letters to an old address, my father's address from decades ago, and by emailing an account I hadn't used in over 10 years. Since no one responded, they claimed they were in the clear to move forward. In reality, not only was this misguided, but it was flat out illegal. You can't just sell a property you don't own, and any legitimate real estate attorney would confirm that in minutes. Yet they persisted. The first I heard of this fiasco was from my friend Caden, who called me in a panic, telling me, "I just saw a sign on your property that says it's for sale as part of an HOA lot sale. Are you aware of this?" To say I was stunned is an understatement. I thought maybe it was some kind of prank or scam. But after several phone calls, I realized it was very real. I cut my work trip short, booked the earliest flight back, and found a big sign near my lodge. HOA property auction. Sold. Future site of community fishing area. I'll never forget the chills I felt reading that. Sold? How? To whom? I confronted the HOA at their next scheduled board meeting. Remember, these are the same people who had never once sent me a genuine notice or made a single phone call to my actual number. I marched in, sat down, and waited. The moment Jareth opened the floor for any comments, I stood up and introduced myself. Silence fell across the room. Many of them had never even seen me in person because I was usually away, and I guess they assumed I'd never show up again. I demanded answers, pointing out that I held a legitimate title to the property, and I'd paid every fee they ever asked for. Jareth had the nerve to tell me that I squandered my chance to keep the property by not paying back fees that were accumulating for years. That's when I asked him to produce any official record, receipts, or at least a ledger that showed I owed more money. He stammered, telling me I should have reached out sooner. Another board member, a woman named Coraline, chimed in, claiming the HOA had tried to contact me via certified mail, but they could not produce any actual receipts from the post office or a signature confirming I received anything. It was obvious they were in over their heads with how sloppy their story was. That's when I told them if they didn't cancel the sale immediately, I'd be pursuing legal action. I walked out, and behind me I overheard Jareth say something like, "He's bluffing." Bluffing? I just walked in with a thick folder of documents, including the deed, the most up-to-date tax statements, and bank records of every HOA payment I'd ever made. Why in the world would I be bluffing? So right away, I hired a real estate attorney, provided all my documentation, and explained the situation. My attorney's eyes went wide. He said, "This might be the clearest case of wrongful taking I've seen in years. They have zero right to do what they're doing." He filed a motion to stop any further transfer of the property, and we sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA. That's where I thought it would end. Maybe they'd realize they messed up, backtrack, apologize, and we'd all move on. But no, they doubled down. They actually claimed they had evidence that I had relinquished my ownership by not paying the so-called debt. I discovered they had an internal policy that said if a property owner is delinquent for some specific number of years, something like 4 or 5, the HOA can vote to seize the property. That policy, of course, has no legal standing if the property owner is proven to be up to date and can easily show official documentation, but that didn't stop them from forging ahead. I was furious, but also oddly fascinated by how brazen they were. My attorney pressed forward, scheduling a hearing. He also advised me to talk to the local district attorney if I suspected fraud, because the entire fiasco gave off more than a whiff of shady dealings. Around this same time, I received an unexpected phone call from a man named Harlan, who claimed he was the buyer of my property at the HOA auction. Harlan was a local contractor who'd been told the property was fully free and clear. He said, "I'm not trying to cause any trouble. I just wanted to see if you'd be willing to sell the fishing lodge to me directly." My jaw dropped. He had no idea that the entire auction was illegitimate. He didn't realize that he'd effectively spent money on something that wasn't theirs to sell. I politely told him, "I'm sorry, but there's no chance I'm selling. I'm already talking to a lawyer." Harlan was understanding. He said he'd likely ask for his money back, which left me feeling sorry for him. This HOA had lied to him as well. Now, I had a feeling I wasn't the only victim in their scheme. Over the next few weeks, I discovered that 2 other families in the neighborhood had gone through smaller, yet suspiciously similar situations. Both had small pieces of land near the community's boundary that the HOA tried to encroach on. Luckily, those families had caved to the HOA's pressure and settled by paying money they probably never owed, just to avoid legal battles. It was extortion, plain and simple. The day of the hearing arrived. My attorney had done a solid job preparing all the evidence: my deed, official receipts, bank statements, and copies of all the letters I'd found from my father's archived paperwork, showing that the property was always in good standing. We also had an affidavit from Caden, who confirmed that no notices were ever posted on the property itself until well after the supposed due date for these fraudulent fees. But the real kicker came when we discovered the HOA's internal emails through a subpoena. Those messages outlined the board's plan to highlight abandoned and neglected properties, basically targeting owners who rarely visited or were often away. Jareth had written, "We can turn these spots into revenue if we prove delinquency or unresponsiveness." If that wasn't damning enough, in one email, Coraline said, "We need to be careful about sending real notices to the correct addresses. Let's mail them to older addresses on file so we can skip a signature verification." It was blatant. Right there, in black and white, they were talking about deliberately sending letters to the wrong address so they could claim the owners never responded. The judge was outraged. He actually paused at one point, looked over his glasses, and asked the HOA's attorney, "Are you seriously suggesting that this is a proper course of action?" The HOA's attorney looked flustered, trying to salvage a defense by saying, "Well, the policy states that if an owner doesn't respond, the board can vote to take the property." But the judge didn't buy it for a second. I remember him saying, "An internal policy doesn't override state law or the rights of a deed holder." It was a short hearing, relatively speaking. By the end, the court granted an injunction preventing the HOA from exercising any claim on my land, but that was just the beginning. The judge also ordered an investigation into possible fraud. I'll never forget the scowls on Jareth's and Coraline's faces. They looked like they wanted to vanish. When I walked out of the courthouse that day, I felt both relief and the simmering anger of someone who's just realized how deep the wrongdoing goes. My attorney, who had seen a lot in his career, told me, "They'll probably try to settle this quietly, but I don't think you should let them off the hook that easily." We pressed criminal charges for fraud, given the evidence of them forging or tampering with official addresses and knowingly misrepresenting property status. The local district attorney got involved, and soon enough, more stories came to light about how Jareth and a few others had systematically targeted folks who rarely visited their properties. They'd hold so-called delinquency votes, file false liens, and either force owners to pay big sums or trick them into letting go of small parcels of land. Once they took over those parcels, they'd sell them at a profit or incorporate them into new community projects. On paper, it made them look like they were expanding the neighborhood, which in turn kept HOA fees lower for everyone else. and made Jareth look like a hero to the unsuspecting residents. But it was all a sham. Even some of the most unsuspecting neighbors were appalled once they realized how it actually worked. As the investigation progressed, the evidence of wrongdoing kept piling up. One day, I got a call from a detective who told me, "We've arrested Jareth and Coraline on suspicion of fraud, conspiracy, and several other charges." I was amazed that it went that far that quickly. Typically, these kinds of white-collar or property disputes can drag on for months or years. But the trove of emails, combined with the testimonies from multiple victims, accelerated the process. Eventually, I learned that Jareth and Coraline were going to trial, along with the HOA itself being sued in a separate civil case. The detective said they'd encourage me to file for damages, considering the emotional and financial strain I'd suffered. My attorney insisted we do exactly that. But that's not the entire story. During all of this, I was dealing with the emotional fallout of nearly losing my fishing lodge. That place is more than just land to me. It's a living memory of my father. I kept thinking, what if I hadn't returned in time? What if Caden hadn't called me? The idea that it could have been bulldozed or turned into a community boathouse made my stomach turn. So I decided to do something symbolic once I was certain the place was safe. I repainted the exterior, used a color scheme my father and I once talked about but never got around to. It was a small act of reclamation, a sign that I was standing my ground and that I'd never again ignore the potential threats around me. During that process, a couple of neighbors stopped by to offer their support. One of them, a longtime resident named Bianca, told me that Jareth had always been arrogant, but after he was elected HOA president, he acted like he owned the entire neighborhood. She apologized for not warning me sooner, but she'd had no idea the lengths he would go to. In the following weeks, the civil trial against the HOA began. The judge took stock of the financial damage to me and the emotional toll. My attorney argued that the HOA had not only violated my rights, but also inflicted emotional distress as I nearly lost a cherished family property. The HOA's defense tried to claim that everything was a misunderstanding and that my father's records might have had an error, but they couldn't dispute the emails or the fact that I was never truly delinquent. The judge ended up fining the HOA $117,000, which, while not a massive sum by some standards, was enough to set an example. That penalty covered legal fees, restitution, and punitive damages related to their unlawful actions. Their finances took a major hit. Suddenly, those low HOA fees they touted ballooned, and the board had to restructure the entire administration. Meanwhile, in the criminal trial, Jareth and Coraline were both found guilty of fraud and conspiracy to commit fraud. They received jail sentences, which stunned me at first because I'd assumed they might just get probation or house arrest. But the judge wanted to set a precedent. He stated, "This kind of malicious targeting of unsuspecting property owners erodes public trust and cannot be tolerated." So yes, 2 HOA representatives ended up behind bars. Even without Jareth and Coraline, the HOA required new leadership, and those leaders were more cautious and fair-minded. Additionally, numerous residents called for the HOA's dissolution, claiming it was too corrupt and overreaching. I monitored local changes but have avoided communal politics. I just wanted to protect my family's land and prevent such a farce. I worked and lived knowing my fishing lodge was protected, and justice had been done. Other ripples occurred. Recall Harlan, the contractor who thought he bought my property. He sued the HOA for misleading business tactics. Since he spent time and money preparing for building, he recovered his money and damages. He reportedly sought to erect modest cabins on the land for weekend rentals, thinking he owned it. That failed, costing him revenue. He sued them, and they settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. Telly, an older neighbor, also reported intimidation. He stated the HOA threatened legal action if he didn't trim a couple massive oak trees on his property. The letter they sent him used strange wording concerning delinquency and compliance. Telly joined a neighborhood class action suit to hold the HOA completely accountable for prior wrongdoings. The HOA's new leadership inherited a jumble of legal difficulties, but they looked motivated to make amends and follow fair practices. While the legal challenges continued, I reunited with local lake lovers. One was Jaya, a local bait-and-tackle shop owner. She confirmed to years of allegations that certain HOA members had murky ties with real estate flippers when I told her about the fiasco. She said, "I'm glad you fought back. Most folks don't have the energy or resources, so they'd rather leave." That comment hit me. I was raised by my father to fight for justice, especially when it hurts me. The legal process was stressful, but I knew I was living true to his beliefs. My attorney exposed me to local historical land record resources, which was a pleasant surprise. My lodge and surrounding property had been in my family for generations, so I uncovered my grandfather's late 1940s drawings for a little fishing dock. That find was precious. My grandfather planned a second dock on the far side of the property for a boathouse. He never did, but reading his notes reminded me of my family's deep connection to that country. It gave the property more meaning and strengthened my resolve to maintain it. Once the HOA scandal headlines subsided, neighborhood life seemed to return to normal. Now that I recognized how valuable and easily lost it was, I spent more weekends at the lodge. I woke up early to view the sunrise over the water and hear fish splashing near the dock. Occasionally, I would pack a picnic, row out onto the lake, and float, thinking about how close I came to losing this calm. I also invited a few trustworthy friends and neighbors to fish, grill, and discuss the property's history. It helped build real community bonds that no HOA contract could ruin. I observed that many were happy to see the old board replaced by more transparent people. The story was incomplete. Jareth and Coraline were criminally charged, thus the legal system sentenced them. Jareth, the leader, was imprisoned and fined heavily. Coraline obtained a lighter sentence but still served many months in prison and probation. When I realized they were booking Jareth into the county jail, I felt strangely happy and sad. Satisfied because justice was served. Sad because greed and deception prevented it. I wondered if he was sorry or furious about getting caught. Regardless, I persuaded myself it wasn't important anymore. My main concern was property preservation. Word spread about the HOA's $117,000 fine, restitution, and penalties, and how it would impact how they funded community programs. Some worried about a rise in their annual dues, while others remarked, "We're just glad they're cleaning house." The new board members publicly discussed scrutinizing every property claim to ensure no one was wrongfully targeted. I kept in touch with a couple of them to be the first to know about any issues with my father's land. They told me it wouldn't happen again. However, I was cautious. Despite everything, life continued on, and I found peace in standing up for myself and others in similar situations. The following time I worked out of state, I asked Caden to watch the lodge again. But this time I said, "If you see even a hint of an auction sign, call me immediately, and then call the sheriff." He chuckled and promised. That trip was uneventful. After returning, the property was mine without for sale notices or dubious letters. It appears the HOA learnt its lesson. I found I could aid neighbors with complex property rules in the months that followed. I studied local real estate laws and HOA statutes. People started knocking on my door for advice on building permits, property issues, and dubious notices. I became an unofficial scam prevention resource. It was surprising to convert an unpleasant experience into something positive for the community. One neighbor, Oriana, was grateful because she was threatened with a large punishment for keeping a small greenhouse in her backyard. She feared they would declare it a code violation and confiscate her land if she didn't demolish it. A real estate expert referred by my attorney stated that greenhouse structures under a particular square footage are free from special permits in our jurisdiction. She also discovered that HOA bylaws never prohibited greenhouses. She persevered and grew veggies and herbs. Oriana's relief reminded me of how helpless I felt when I saw that auction sign. I recognized property owners must know their rights. An unexpected twist included a local history society. They contacted me after hearing about the scandal to document the fishing lodge as living history. They were collecting stories about local family-owned properties for a heritage brochure. I was initially hesitant because I value my privacy. However, when I thought about it, I realized it may add to the evidence that the lodge is important to me and the community. I let them include a brief description and 2 images of the original foundation. If I had dock fishing photos with my father, they wanted to use them. 2 antique prints from when I was 10 showed me clutching a little fish with the brightest smile. It was beautiful closure to share that memories publicly after the HOA's unscrupulous activities nearly erased it. My previous lawsuit was settled after months. I was declared the property's free and clear owner by the court, and the HOA could not interfere or make any additional claims against it without a proper basis, which they would likely never have. The judge's order was clear, so I felt secure at least. My attorney suggested more damages, but I declined. In my opinion, the $117,000 fine, criminal convictions, and HOA internal restructuring were enough to prove my case. I don't want to spend my life in court. I wanted it resolved permanently. Additionally, I installed a gate with a programmed lock and a large private property no trespassing sign at the entrance to my driveway. That may seem extravagant, but I wasn't taking chances after everything that happened. Trusted neighbors had the code, and the new HOA had my address and phone number. I gladly addressed valid complaints. At this point, I only wanted to interact with the HOA for formality. Looking back, the whole event taught me about vigilance, property rights, and how far certain HOA boards will go if unchallenged. I remember my father's voice. He constantly emphasized, "If you don't stand up for what's right, you give power to those who do wrong." I'm glad I could fight back. Many give up when faced with legal threats and complex property issues. You must sometimes press forward and punish wrongdoers. I saved my fishing resort and exposed a fraud network that was hurting neighbors. The HOA learned a valuable lesson when 2 of the principal criminals were imprisoned. That property is now more dear to me. Every fish I catch and every sunrise I view from the back porch confirms that standing up for yourself is worth it. I've built a real community based on mutual respect, not coercive regulations, which reminds me that adversity can bring out the best in people who refuse to be bullied. I still live part-time in that lodge, combining my career with gratitude. A new fireplace in the living room was a dream project for my father and me. Beautiful stone design suits the rustic appeal of the place. I wonder what Dad would say when he sees it finished. He would stand back, nod, and say, "Looks like home." And it is. My home, sanctuary, and legacy. No amount of paperwork, unethical HOA board, or fake auction sign will change that. I battled for this spot with everything I had. Finally, justice won, and I can sit by that hearth, listening to the wood crackle, knowing I did right by my father and myself. My land has not been claimed again. Final court rulings are on record, and the new HOA board says they respect my boundaries. They've even changed the regulations so no board member can say a property is abandoned without thorough checks and contact attempts. Interestingly, this calamity protects the community from future manipulations. In their follow-up article, the local newspaper noted, "The owners who were once silent have found their voice, ensuring such an infringement never occurs again." I loved that. Many people felt this way after realizing that justice does happen, although slowly. Since things has settled, I've enjoyed life more than ever. Due to the lodge's lakeside location, I grill fresh fish on weekends. I invited my supportive neighbors and new acquaintances from my attorney's introductions to community members. Conversations have been lively and tension-free. People make small-town politics jokes, rejoice in Jareth's collapse, and exchange fishing tips. Someone occasionally asks if I worry about another sleazy HOA president. I smile and say, no, because if they try, I'll be ready for them. I mean it. I no longer ignore HOA meetings or official communications. I won't attend every meeting, but if there's a property issue, I'll be there with my paperwork and questions. The jail sentences Jareth and Coraline received also delivered a strong message that crossing certain borders has consequences. A change in the air has kept the new HOA leadership on their toes, making them more upfront and vocal about changes and projects. Some neighbors found a silver lining. It unified residents to pay more attention to decision-making. Monthly meetings draw more people who want precise budgeting and open voting on major issues. Transparency seems to be the new standard. Though I remain skeptical, I'm glad individuals feel emboldened to fight for their rights. Finally, Harlan, the contractor who thought he bought my property at the illegal HOA auction, became my buddy. Our chat started awkwardly but improved. He recognized he'd been duped, and I saw he was simply a businessman misinformed. His goodwill gesture was to help me with some renovations at a discount. We built a boathouse addition my grandfather had envisioned, but never got to, so that part of my family's legacy is accomplished. Harlan's a good craftsman, and I'm delighted we met in a strange way and finished well. I suppose my land's tale is still being written, but I control it now. Friends, thank you. See you soon.